Yeah, let's get started. We're missing one of the panelists, but she'll be here shortly. Good afternoon, girls and gays. My name is Raffy Ermac, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Pride.com.
I'm Jessie. I contribute to Pride.com, so he's my boss. So treat him nicely.
She's the host of our web series called Nerd Out, where she does a bunch of explainers on cool, queer, nerdy topics.
Yeah. And talk about Star Trek a bunch, because, of course.
Of course. Hi, I'm... Sorry.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Satine. I'm co-host of Bit Different Podcast with this one, which is like a queer-inspired, nerdy pop culture video game podcast.
And I'm Rob, co-host of Bit Different Podcast, and also I make game trailers for a living, so at least I work in the nerd space by day anyway.
Me too.
Yeah.
And their podcast is wonderful, and I love it.
Thanks.
Yeah, so the reason Jessie and I started this, wanted to do this panel is just talk about queer representation in some of our favorite titles and topics, especially in sci-fi, and talk about the future of queer representation, the past, and how it's changed over the years.
Yeah. So before we get started, and we have a bunch of questions that we're going to talk about and topics on the panel. I just wanted to give, for those of you, I'm sure a lot of us already know this, but a good primer on queer representation in Hollywood and sort of the big budget representation. So as many of you may or may not know, way back when Hollywood started, queer representation was not uncommon. That may be surprising, but even the best picture, one of the best picture winners, Wings, in 1920-something, I forget the exact year. 28, thank you very much. Featured a same-gendered kiss in it. And there was a lot of films that had a lot of same-gender relationships or even sort of lesbian relationship. Morocco featured the first lesbian kiss in all of cinema. That was way back in the 20s. So then when you hit around the 50s, you get something called the Hays Code, or the Hollywood Production Code of 1950 or 30. Am I blanking on the years? Anyways, the Hays Code comes around because of, everyone sort of saying Hollywood's morally degenerate and corrupt, which is probably true, but not for showing queer people. And so they instituted the Hays Code, which was done by this, Christian leader, William Hayes, I believe is his name. And he basically created a code that was super, racist, sexist, saying you couldn't show law enforcement in a bad light, you couldn't show interracial relationships or sex, and obviously, queer sex or queer relationships in any way, shape, or form. So what that led to was characters that became what was known as queer coded. And a lot of us know today, if you know what queer coding is, we see it as sort of a bad thing. But at the time, what it was a way to show queer characters without actually saying they're explicitly queer. It'd be this character would be a bit more, a guy character would be a bit more effeminate, or a woman would be a bit more masculine presenting, which is a stereotypical way to present queer people, but was a way to at least signal to the audience, hey, look, here's a queer character, even though we can't say it's queer. And unfortunately, as things progressed, it was bad enough that they had to do it that way, but it was at least a way to have some form of representation. But as things progressed, because whenever you had those characters, they tend to have to be punished for the transgressions that was in the Hays Code. If you had a criminal, the criminal had to be killed at the end. That's why we got a lot of gangster films where criminals died. So queer people tend to be more and more coded as villains. And even as the Hays Code went away, that caused, that sort of stuck around in cinema. That's why you see in Disney movies, a lot of the villains like Scar, Jafar, pretty much name any Disney villain even up until today, you have villains that are sort of queer-coded, they talk more effeminately, they don't have any partners, Ursula's like a drag queen, sort of using queerdom as a villainous thing. And that leads us to today, where we still get a lot of queer-coded characters. We're starting to see more explicit representation, usually in smaller screen adaptations, because smaller screen adaptations, you can, there's less at stake. Hollywood's if we have a queer character, we can't sell it to China, as South Park brought to light recently, but that's sort of been around for a while, because China, censors anything queer related. And so when we get to bigger budget productions, you're starting to see a push for it, but it's more in the sense of it's starting to become safer and more, able to, do it without risking money, because capitalism is awful, and we all know this. So that's sort of a brief history of queer coding, just to sort of get us started. And I think what we wanted to talk about today was, how we found those representations, what spoke to queer people and us as queer people as we watched science fiction, and what we found. So, yeah.
I feel like I'm in school or something.
Yes.
So I guess to kick things off, my first question for all of you all is, what do you think it is about science fiction and like other geeky genres too, like fantasy and superhero, that is so inherently queer and that immediately draws big audiences of LGBTQ people?
Well, at least I feel like a lot of the sort of motivation that would drive a lot of queer people to sci-fi is this idea of hopefully a more perfect world, like some sort of other take on things where hopefully like there's another sort of like, I won't say rule set, but there's another sort of set of morals where maybe we haven't had to go through this sort of like bleaching of our presence up until more recent time. Like it should be more evolved people, more like people that are more open to stuff. Like there's more potential to truly be who you are in like maybe the future, or at least something else. At least I feel like that's maybe one of the reasons why there's so much potential. Like you get to make the rules. Like if you're creating a new sci-fi environment or IP, at least that's one thing.
Yeah, literally the sky's the limit. I mean, you could have so many variations, especially when you're talking about races and peoples that don't even exist. If you create them, then it could be whatever you want.
Because in our research, for this, just to be as prepared as we could, one thing I kept thinking of was Mass Effect.
Yeah.
Just in that, like, there's an entire race in that game that is that is in a sense one gender, but I think really officially like the Asari are more in a sense genderless, and even with that, like they are very at least open when it comes to their relationships, cross. I don't want to say species isn't the right word, but like across race, gender, like the Asari are very open. But this feels like, it's in a thing where like we've already stopped the binary sort of definition in that world already, in a sense, at least especially for the Asari.
Oh, hey.
Hello.
Hi.
Our final
Oh.
panelist.
Oh.
Yay.
Want to introduce yourself?
Hey. My name is Cartesia Kent. I work for Entertainment Weekly. I also live on Twitter. I'm taking a break right now. But yeah, trying to get up here was interesting. They have better security than most airports. Yeah, so.
She's also the best dressed on here.
I was gonna say your outfit is amazing.
Yeah.
We were just talking about what it is about science fiction and like other geeky genres that is so inherently queer and that draws big audiences of LGBT people. If you want to chime in.
Excellent question. I would just say like the fantastical nature of it. When you have these like historical dramas or things that are based on reality or like anything that kind of champions itself as being grounded, ironically, marginalized people are missing from the picture. So like people will pretend that queer people are new advent, or that black people are new advent, or disabled people never existed until like 2 seconds ago. So I think the fantastical nature of it removes those kind of standard excuses. So now you're like, okay, well, we're in like space, or we're in like dimension Z. Like you don't really have an excuse to act like none of us exist.
Mm-hmm.
And for like kind of brushing on what everyone was sort of saying is like, for example, I'm a huge Trekkie, and that's sort of what I always go back to. But like Star Trek shows, what I love about Star Trek, it does two things with queer people. One, up until recently, they mainly were able to talk about queer people through science fiction allegory, which has its own negatives, and I'll probably talk about that with a future question down the road that we have. But it is also great to be like, look, there are characters like Jessie Earl in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, who is like a character who used to be a man in a previous host life, but now is a woman. And I read that and I'm like, oh, this is a trans representation, even though she's not explicitly trans. And that's something that I can invest in and see myself in a way that I couldn't really see anywhere. And it's also a safe way for me to do that, because I can be like, I love Jessie Earl, and my parents are thinking, it's like, oh, he is just a nerd, instead of being like, oh, she's trans. So it's sort of a safe way to express that. And something else that I also find, talking about like superheroes and why superheroes are so popular today, and I talked about this on our panel last year a bit, is that there is something in that narrative of like having to hide the best part of yourself, hide your secret identity. That was such like a big thing for me, is like I got that. It's like, oh, I can, this is something that's so important to me, but I can't tell anybody because it put myself in danger, put them in danger. I might get hurt because of that. So that always spoke to me. And what I find interesting within that, moving into today, is like you look at a lot of superhero stories today, and most of the stories don't really have the superheroes hiding their secret identity anymore. Like all the Avengers have pretty much all their identities known, even, spoiler alert for Spider-Man Homecoming, even that. And so it's like, oh, the secret identity thing is going away, and I wonder if that's part and parcel with like how queerdom is starting to become more to the fore. I find that to be an interesting sort of parallel.
So going off that, what's each of yours favorite sci-fi show, movie, comic book, etc., and what is it about that fandom that first drew you guys in? I guess we'll go down.
I'm a obvious Marvel fan, so my go-to is always X-Men. It's like just perfect allegory for like literally everything, which is why the movies are very upsetting. So, yeah.
I'm a Star Wars girl. It sounds kind of basic, but that's like the first fandom that really caught my attention.
Mine, obviously, Star Trek. The reason I love it is, and it kind of goes, again, with what you guys are saying, is like, it shows a future that is expressly our future. It's not like, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, or like, it's like, this is what comes out of, Western American society, to be fair, but like what human society could look like. And it's a world that loves diversity, it loves the difference in people, and just celebrates that in a really unique way, and fails a lot of the time, as writers in any creation fails, but also tries to show the beauty and love of diversity. And that's what really speaks to it for me, is just like, hey, this is a world that I want to see happen. This is a world that, for all its problems, that the goals that it's showing are something beautiful and speak to me. And like, ever since I was a kid, that's been instilled in me. Like, I don't think I would be as, who I am today and have the values that I have if I hadn't found Star Trek at a young age. And I love it for that.
Yeah, I think, I started with Star Wars because my dad he had one of the largest Star Wars collections in the world when I was growing up. So that's where I began. Sold it all off by now, but unfortunately. But and then I went to Star Trek. I wouldn't say evolved, but I moved on. And I feel like I do that with all aspects of my life. Like I love something for a time, and then I evolve, I move on. Battlestar Galactica was definitely one of those times. I always identify with the villains. Admiral Kane, I don't know if any of you saw Battlestar, but she's boss. Yeah.
But it also goes to queer coding, too.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I love Battlestar because it had a lot of queer characters in it, even though they were on the DL for a long time in it. But it's they're there. And now, even though am I just really loud?
I think it's making it a little close.
If you want to hear,
Hi, sorry. And hi. Is that better? Or am I just loud?
I think this might have been close. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. So, but now I like The Witcher, which isn't technically sci-fi, but it's still fantasy. Create your own world.
Yeah. Well, and my number one fandom is actually probably The Simpsons, so it's not really sci-fi at all. But like when it came to the sci-fi stuff, I realized like the stuff I spend the most time in is all video game related, and so it made me think a lot, at least, about some games that I've really attached to. And like, I mean, this is just a fun little because I've been working on the Outer Worlds campaign since it launched, or since the campaign started, and at least I can at least confirm there is LGBTQ representation in that game.
So excited.
Which is kind of cool, because one thing I realized, at least from my thoughts about like Mass Effect, because Mass Effect was one of the first times I'd really had like any sort of same-sex romance options that were like truly like you could participate in. And but the bummer is I realized, like, at least for me, I didn't meet a canonically gay character in that until the third one. And so often, a lot of it spoke to this, I hate to say, like a weird sort of like growing up fantasy of like, well, they're interested in me if I ask nicely. like they've never expressed any sort of interest in any same-sex relationships at all. But if you ask Miranda real nice, you know, under certain contexts, then yes, she is open to, I guess, being bisexual in this world. And so it's kind of, it's interesting in that, like, I didn't meet like a truly like gay character until the third one, and it broke my heart to break up with Tally to be with him. But you gotta do what you gotta do. And so at least like
Poor
that's
Tally.
you know, yeah, poor Tally, I love her.
I killed her.
Monster.
Burying your gate.
On accident.
She identifies with villains.
Well, something that I'm finding interesting too with video games too is this movement. There was Cyberpunk, the new Cyberpunk game.
Yeah.
They just announced that you're not going to be choosing your gender in that. You're just going to
genderless.
choose your body type.
And your voice type.
Yeah, which is like super cool. I'm like so
comes out.
Yeah, I'm like.
It has a date.
No, it hasn't released.
April.
Yeah.
After what, like 8 years?
That's been a long time.
But yeah, no, I'm super excited about that because I'm super excited to have like a female body type and then just have like this gruff male voice come out of it. And I'm like, because that's like me to a degree. Not that I have like the most masculine voice, but like I know that feel and like that's super. I don't know. I'm just very excited about that.
Well, because and right now we are sort of seeing like an interesting level of the video game industry kind of reacting. I think because I know like I feel like the Cyberpunk thing was almost a reaction to the sort of 2 or 3 missteps that have happened as that game has gotten promoted recently, where there's been some insensitivities that have been called out, and I think this was almost them sort of like being like, okay, cool, like we're making a big adjustment here in order to like sort of recognize that we don't really need to have a like they don't need to have a place in this. They just need to let people choose instead of being like, well, this is the the line in the sand here. At least that's my interpretation of that because there were a few things that people kind of responded to. But like even I was thinking like even like Gears of War 5. Gears of War, we haven't gotten a character who has been confirmed to be LGBTQ yet. But at least for the multiplayer, they added player banners and emblems that are pride related, and I think they even have like the pride, the transgender flag, the bisexual flag. I think they've quite a bit of emblems, and of course then a small vocal minority of the internet got very upset about it.
Of course.
But like it's even like in a game that is so like overtly machismo, although it is actually really making I think great strides with the Kate storyline for the new the new titles. It's kind of cool to actually see them like at least work in this sort of stuff of like, hey, if you want to have this as your your player banner, go with it. Bungie did the same thing recently for Destiny 2. And so like we're starting to see at least more of like at least even as players they're recognizing that the players exist.
Yeah.
Even if it's not in the game.
So I had the next question, and one that I wanted to ask everyone, but I'm going to change it a little bit just based off of like what we were all just talking about and what you were just sort of saying is like, what I find interesting is sometimes there are reactions and like building off of mistakes in the past to create better representation. Like for example, the one that I find intriguing, and I don't know, I still don't know how I feel about it, is in spoilers for Star Trek Discovery, if anyone hasn't seen that yet, but there's a gay character in that who gets killed in the first season. And he's also the man of color, like the one man of color in that show. So it's like, oh great, you killed the one man of color in the gay character. But then in the second season, they bring him back. And what I liked about how they at least handled it, I don't think it was worth it. I don't think that they should have killed him. I think it was very upsetting. As much as I like Star Trek Discovery, I thought that was unnecessarily traumatizing in a show that's supposed to be about diversity. But they brought him back. And what I at least appreciated about that is they didn't handle it in a way where it's like, all right, he's back, we're good, we're washing our hands of it. He had to deal with PTSD. And as much as, again, sucks to see a character have to go through PTSD, seeing another gay character go through PTSD, and like, again, this is why I have so many mixed feelings on it, but it was handled in a way that felt real, and I thought was handled very realistically despite the weird, crazy sci-fi situation. Like Wilson Cruz talking about like how he dealt with disassociation. And like understanding like how disassociation affects people with PTSD and how they sort of distance themselves from the world and push themselves away from people they care about. I thought it was just handled really nicely, and it was a good taking a mistake and acknowledging it and doing something with it, even if it wasn't necessarily the right thing to have done in the first place. So I guess the question I want to ask all of you is like, is there an example of characters that you really loved that they mishandled, and how do you feel about that?
So I don't know if, at least at the top of my head, if there's a character I feel like that was totally mishandled. It does bum me out when I see a show that takes several seasons to finally introduce a character. Like, I feel like we should probably just give a overall blanket statement. There would be spoilers throughout this entire panel. But like, let's just say, Stranger Things, we finally got a queer character in season 3. I love how they handled that. Like, I love that character. But aside from, I guess, weird speculation about a child's sexuality with Will, like, we finally got a character that is like truly like self-identifying queer. But yeah, 3 seasons. That show was huge, and it took 3 seasons. Of course, I guess if you want to take it down a weird rabbit hole, that show takes place in the 80s, it could go into some dark territory. That's honestly not that show's storyline to tell. But like, but I did think it was kind of interesting. We finally got like a true like character, and even like the reveal was so effortless in a way. I was like, oh, there we go. But yeah, I don't know if I'm trying to think if I have any like one that are problematic, but keep going.
Well, in Battlestar, there's Lieutenant Gaeta, who is in the entire series, but he does come out, but only in a webisode that wasn't actually related to the seasons. Well, it's related, but it was in a separate season series. So people got really angry because he's a main character. He has this interesting storyline, and they only revealed it online. It's not even really part of the actual season, any of the seasons. So I feel that was really mishandled. And also, gosh, there was another one I had to...
Well, I think we talked about this even last year at the panel a little bit. And of course, like, Sci-Fi often lump fantasy in with, just rather, very geek, but very gay focused, or gay-friendly genres. Dumbledore, I think, is like
Dumbledore.
Just the best example of like,
that's the one.
Why now? Why are you telling me this now? Like, which is cool. It's great that he is, but I haven't really seen any real impact of it, or really, I don't know why it had to happen after the books were done.
We're waiting for the next Fantastic Beasts.
I don't want to speak too much because I've already spoken a lot, but I'll quick say with that is like what frustrates me is it's always like we'll get to it down the road, like Valkyrie's bi in Thor Ragnarok, but not explicitly. We'll get to it maybe in the next one possibly. Frozen, wait till Frozen 3 to get your queer Elsa.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's always like the passing, like, hey, queer people, it's there, but we'll like pass the buck down the road. So, anyways, I don't want to speak too much because
it's not really sci-fi, but Legend of Korra. I love how like 4 seasons, literally the last minute in the last season, they finally reveal that Korra and Asami are queer and they love each other. And I love Korra, like Korra's that girl, and I liked it a little more than Avatar, but I just hate that like we could have had for 4 seasons we could have had a queer main character like kicking ass, but they just waited to literally the last minute.
That was going to be my example. But, I will add by saying I got so much hate when I tweeted this, but it was just like, so my issue with a lot of media that does end up, either including queer characters or maybe like winking at like a character maybe being queer is that like you have to depend on subtext or like you have to read between the margins, and that's really annoying to me. So when the thing happened with Korra, I like turned my TV off and I just walked off, and my brother was like, what happened? And I'm just like, some BS. But my other example, if I'm sticking with like the X-Men theme, is definitely Mystique. Mystique is explicitly bi in canon, and she entertains mostly Destiny, who is this disabled sidekick a character. She has some sort of ability, and that gets not included obviously in these movies or whatever. We keep kind of bouncing her back between these boring cis men, Charles and what's his name, Eric. I'm just like okay, but she has other things that she could be doing, I guess. It's just weird because there's for me specifically, because I am bi, there's this weird thing that happens in not just like sci-fi and fantasy, but even like a comedy or like any normal show or standard piece of media where like the bi character male or female or whatever they identify as will maybe get to be like explicitly bi for like 2 seconds. Like you'll see them obviously date some other gender, and then like maybe in that same episode or maybe like the very next episode something happens like, oh, it didn't work out, I'm back with this dude, or back with whatever like gender that they're, you know, technically supposed to be with or whatever. So yeah, the Mystique thing bothers me a lot because again, explicitly bi and we don't really get to see it.
Well, it's fine. Like the Korra thing almost sounds almost like it was, you know, like, well, we've hinted, and now that we're several seasons in, we kind of realize that maybe people don't care, but also this is the very end. Mic drop. Like, get upset. It's over. You know, it's like it almost feels like sometimes it is like, yeah, we've had this character for a couple seasons, and we've done some focus group testing, and people like this character enough where even if they, you know, an element of their personality finally gets revealed, even our like diehards who maybe aren't necessarily cool will be cool just because they love the character. It's almost like, you know, it's like we've tested it, we'll make it.
We've incepted queerness in.
Maybe that will happen between Katris, Scorpia, and She-Ra in She-Ra, because they have an interesting love triangle.
And that's the problem, going back to what you said about subtext, is that sometimes subtext goes way over a lot of people's heads. So like unless like you're looking for it, like you miss it otherwise.
That's sorry.
No, go ahead.
That's something like it bothered me too in like the latest It Chapter 2 movie. Like it drove me crazy because I went and saw it with my partner who is also trans and bi, and you know I talk about this stuff all the time, so she has a pretty good barometer for like reading subtext. And we went and saw the movie, and again, spoilers, the whole arc of Bill Hader's character, who's like the central, you know, he has the most character growth in that movie. His whole arc is, you know, he's gay and hasn't been able to come out about it his entire life. And then the person that he has feelings for at the end, again, spoilers, I won't say who, but that character dies. And then there's a moment in the like one of the scenes where you like he's surrounded by his friends, they're all being supportive, he's crying that his friends died, and you're like, oh, this is the moment he's gonna come out, he's gonna say it. It's like, I'm gay. And he doesn't. And like that's his arc. That's his character's arc in the thing, is that he needs to come out and accept who he is, and he doesn't do it in the film. And they like subtly hint towards it, like he writes his name next to like heart, me, and this other guy that died, and this bridge at the end. And I'm like, but you're not making it clear. Just say it, because that's the point of his arc, and they don't. And I left the movie, and I'm like, oh, that was, at least it was like somewhat clear. And then I turned to my partner, and she's like, he was gay? And she's like, and she's one who like she's really good at that stuff. And I'm like, yeah, because they want to be able to sell this movie in China or wherever that like explicitly hides this stuff because of the government there, and you know, and also just in America because you don't want to cause a controversy with, you know, certain groups. And it's just like, but if you don't do that, you're number one, you're not fulfilling your story, and you're also, you know, these stories have power. These stories can change people's minds. Like that's. You know, that's the stuff with Korra, and it's like, you know, as problematic as it is, and as problems I have is like we need more explicitly queer characters who are queer from the start, and that's important. There is also something to be said about like showing that in a movie that's like surprise gay. It does at least teach that, and it's like if you're gonna do that, at least do it so it means something, and you know, there's benefits to both sides of it, I guess.
I'm also gonna add, on one hand, the China thing is often a cop-out. Because we have enough homophobia in this country to deal with, and I don't think we need to be exporting, you know, or would it be importing? Whatever, whatever the actual correct word is, it, you know, our hate from other countries. I feel like, you know, executives here have enough of an issue with it that it keeps getting either sidelined or just omitted. And then the second part, just, you know, piggybacking off the it thing. That really made me upset because, first of all, Bill Hader is an excellent actor, and I know he could have pulled it off. They gave him that room to do it, and they don't. And then in addition to that, again, spoilers, if you have watched the film or if you haven't, there's explicitly at the beginning of the film a very terrible hate crime that obviously is geared towards queer people, but explicitly like, you know, gay men. And I thought it was very disrespectful to kind of retain that part of the book, you know, be like, hey, you know, this is what was happening in the 80s, blah, blah, and then you have the background of like AIDS and HIV, right? Even if it's not mentioned in the film. So they're okay with putting that, you know, as dying something terrible happening to us, but they can't give us a moment where we're affirming ourselves or sharing ourselves with our friends or family, or even just loudly declaring that we're here. I thought it was I was like, why? Like, why? And then, obviously you think about who made the movie and whatever, but I feel like that imbalance that happens in media where, they're okay with us dying versus showing us in these like happier situations, maybe dramatic situations that don't necessarily require death. I think it's something that's worth delving into, because there's something there that's like very disturbing to me.
I think part of it goes to like, because some executive in the scene is like, oh, we're being so woke with this scene. Like look, we're showing people are gonna feel sad for the gay character, and like with a lot of that, and I see this in Star Trek. Like one of my favorite episodes of Star Trek does this, where they want to talk about queer issues, and they, straight person like wants like, let's talk about queer issues and queer representation, and what they want to do is they want to make you feel bad. Like look, we should feel bad for these people, and we need to like treat them better and do better. And so like the story is being told to teach a lesson to other people, and like I said, there's value in that, and I get that. But the problem is because it's mostly straight creators creating, media that speaks to straight, that's supposed to speak directly to straight people, they tend to want to do this, that sort of like lesson thing. And it's like, but then that's all we're allowed to be. All we're allowed to be is the lesson. All we're allowed to be is just this sort of thing to teach you. And we so rarely get to like be celebrated and have, or just be part of a narrative. Like one of my favorite characters is Nomi in Sense8, who is a trans woman, but she's better known for her abilities as a hacker. And like her transness isn't incidental. There are storylines that involve her transness in that, but her abilities and her contribution to the story is that she's a hacker. And I love that you can have queer characters that are defined by other traits, and their queerness or their transness or they're part of a minority group is just part of their story, but not the defining part of it. And I think that's important.
So, going off that, do you remember the first time you guys ever saw yourself explicitly in media, in sci-fi or whatever?
Downton Abbey.
Yeah, I have no idea. It's funny, actually, I think probably the first time, and I can't remember the character's name now, which is real weird. I think probably the closest I've gotten to like the level of at least how much thought I put into my sexuality versus how I kind of just operate on a day-to-day basis was Scott Pilgrim's roommate. Like, and I mean, that's like pretty late. I was like in my, when I can talk about how old I was when that thing happened. But like, yeah, I think, I mean, just, I don't know, because for the longest time, I was still trying to figure out exactly how I even fit into, because like, based on the representation I'd seen growing up and trying to, and I guess, and coming to terms with being honest and coming out and all this sort of stuff, like, I didn't see any representation, so I didn't have what I felt was, I guess, a sort of primer for how I am going to handle myself. I thought if I was going to come out, I had to change my personality to be what I'd seen. And then, to be honest, like, the first representation I saw that made me really identify was not Sci-Fi, it was a real person. It was the Dave Holmes from MTV. Was one of the first times that I realized, like, oh, okay, I can just be a massive nerd who's very, like, just my brain's full of useless information, or very useful now, it seems, since I've made a living out of it, and and also gay, and like that was the thing that clicked for me. But I still haven't seen a character, I think, that really like hit it home for me yet.
Yeah, I would say I'm just an accumulation of a ton of different characters, honestly, probably all villains, a lot of Disney in there. Even though it's not sci-fi related, it is nerd related. I would think maybe Chun-Li from Street Fighter had a lot to do with me coming to terms, because I remember my brother, when we were at the arcade, back when you had to stand in line, he'd be like, why do you always choose the girl? And it's always stuck with me, and I never really had an answer, because she's the coolest to me. But it's something that stuck with me, and I'm like, okay, well, maybe there is something there. Why do I always choose Katana? Why do, when I'm playing Diablo for the first time, I choose the Amazon? It's always the woman. And I think it accumulated through my life where I start identifying with these characters because that's who I am, and that's who I always was. I just didn't have a way to express it until I transitioned. So, yeah.
For me, first character that really spoke to me was Nomi, like I mentioned.
I love her.
Yeah, I adore her with all of my heart. I will share quickly one of my favorite stories. The first time I realized I was trans through pop culture was the first live-action Scooby-Doo movie, where, weirdly enough, there's that scene where they all switch bodies. And there's a point where Fred is in Daphne's body, and he's like, I'm going to look at myself naked. And I'm like, why would you want to look at yourself naked? And then I'm like, wait, I want to be a girl, not for the sex part, because I want to be a girl, just because I want to be a girl. So it was that was how I learned about sex and then gender, and it was very confusing, all wrapped up in a Scooby-Doo wrapper. So try unraveling that knot.
Just pull that mask off.
Exactly.
I'll go back.
Okay, cool. Okay, all right. Mine's not even sci-fi related, really. Mine is Annalise Keating from How to Get Away with Murder. She is a dark-skinned, bisexual lawyer. Not quite murderer, but almost there. Because she manages, for the most part, to technically keep her hands clean. But she. I don't want to say it was sudden, because I feel like she's always had this flirtatious vibe with everyone, which is why I really love her. And then Famke shows up and they're like, oh yeah, we used to have a thing, and I'm like, what? So that was very exciting for me, because I had seen bi characters before, I'd seen black characters before, but never in one package who calls herself Viola Davis. So I was very excited about that, and things like that kind of give me hope that, hey, there are people out there actually working on these things, even if they are very slow. So
mine isn't really sci-fi related either, but I've only just recently seen myself reflected in media through Nico Santos from Superstore. I've never seen a gay Filipino femme funny, hilarious on TV before. And then also Titus from Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt, another unapologetically femme, plus size, queer, man of color. So this was just recently, and those aren't even sci-fi. But I'll say growing up how you always pick girls. Who I had to identify with growing up too was characters like Padme and other strong women, because how to put this, they were so they were independent, free thinking, queens, costume changes, and I don't know, there was just something about all the women. They were more compelling to me growing up, and I always identified with that. I had to hide my femininity growing up, and then they were powerful and loved in spite of it. So I really found that powerful growing up, basically.
So the question I had next on the list was, and we kind of touched upon this, but to ask explicitly, what tropes do you see queer coded characters in that you've liked but also have found problematic? For me, my example would be, we constantly see non-binary characters as asexual aliens or robots. Even for example, I think one of the most recent prominent examples was in Borderlands 3. There is a non-binary character as one of the playable characters, but they're a robot.
Oh, Flack?
Yeah, Flack. And it's
that's what I'm playing as, actually.
Yeah, which is I'm very happy to see more non-binary representation, but again, non-binary representation is always hey, look, they're an alien, look, they're a robot, look, they don't have gender, and it's non-binary people exist as human beings in the world. So that's sort of my example that I find to be, again, there are benefits to it. There are good things to get people to understand non-binary, but then they just sort of see non-binary people as asexual robots. So obviously negatives. So yeah, I'm just curious what you guys, what tropes you see.
Well, there's the very sexualized trope like Frankenfurter from Rocky Horror, even though Frankenfurter was a huge part of my growing up because I love the character. But it's a little problematic, especially when I was 6 years old and I was I want to wear fishnets and walk around in a garter belt. Maybe not the most, well, it was inspiring to me, but maybe not the best role model for me. But, that was also the 70s, and I think characters are evolving, but, Yeah, I would say that being sexualized, trans or queer characters are all very problematic.
I'd say it's probably the sort of sassy, quippy, gay best friend kind of thing. I mean, yes, we can dress cute and have witty remarks, but also we aren't here to perform all the time. Because even like during Orphan Black, Felix is a great example of sort of like this light comic relief. He is highly functional as a character, which is great, but like he's not nearly as functional and awesome as Cosima, which at least who was queer from the get-go, which is awesome. But yeah, like there's that sort of like, yeah, just the comic relief element that's the harder thing to sort of just be like, all right, cool, like I don't have to be spitting gems all the time.
I hate Bury Your Gays, obviously the most. I think the most recent example in like science fiction is the 100 with what's her name?
Clexa?
Yeah.
Or that's their ship name. I forget the actual. Does that
The character?
Yeah.
Lexa.
Lexa, thank you.
Lex and
She's
Clark?
she was explicitly queer, right? And then dead.
Yeah, that was sad. I remember that.
I hate all of them. If I can narrow it down, I guess the first one, and you'll have to forgive me because I can't think of an explicit sci-fi example. The only recent example of this that I can actually think of is Pose. I don't like, the queer as a result of trauma. That pisses me off. Because you're saying that, my queerness, my transness, whatever I am, is in direct response to something terrible that happened to me, which is no. And then if it further like others, queer people, because it's almost like, oh, you're this mutation or you're this anomaly that happened because, again, this terrible thing happened. And I'm just like, everybody has trauma. Like, why is this a thing that, is so explicitly associated with queer people? And then this isn't technically a trope, but it's come up somewhat on the panel, is almost like the queer as an afterthought, slash, queer getting, cut on the editing room floor. I have a lot of issues with this, particularly with the MCU. It's happened twice now with Valkyrie and Okoye. And I'm like, if you can sneak a shawarma scene into the last 5 minutes of Avengers, you can show Okoye like winking at like, so it's annoying. But yeah.
And just to wrap things up, because I know we're almost out of time. Yeah, a lot of media has slowly but surely been getting more and more LGBT inclusive very, very, very slowly. And some franchises more than others. But do any of you think you'll ever see like a day when at least maybe like every show or every movie has 1 or 2 queer characters, or like, and we're not just performing or just an afterthought to people?
I think it'll happen, but it's going to require us to be in the room. Mm-hmm. I feel like if we keep depending on, the common denominator, or like the classic cis white male who can't really relate to anyone, we're just going to keep seeing ourselves come up as like tokens or afterthoughts.
And something that, like, I run a YouTube channel, and a lot of the comments that I get when I talk about queerness, they're like, why are gay people in every film now? Why do they need to be in everything? And I'm like, well, they're like in what, like 6? And the only reason you're like noticing it is because like we were not there at all before. And so now you're like, oh, look, gay people are in a thing. They have to be in everything. It's like, no, you're just noticing because we weren't there before. And I feel like that's the big push to like get through, is people like, having to push through this really like this line of like, it's been this way for so long, and so everyone thinks that this is the way it should be. And it's like, we know we need to go through that. And I think what it's going to take is the next generation. Not to use a Star Trek pun.
Engage.
But like the people growing up now, like, you know, the kids growing up now, hopefully they will be able to watch and see, like, you know, they'll turn on Star Trek and there'll be a gay character there. They'll turn on, you know, like any CW show and there'll be queer characters there. And it won't be perfect. And, you know, I hate to be like, oh, it's going to take time, because it shouldn't take time. It should just exist. But at least what gives me hope is like these small changes are being made, and so maybe the next generation will like get it a little bit more, because it will seem more normal. And I think that that's the biggest thing, that even though will take a lot longer than I want it to, I think that's what it's really going to take, is just like slowly making queer people just being part of things as normal, as opposed to queer people being like, hey, look, it's the queer character. Look at how a big deal it is. Like, we got our queer character in the show now, finally. It's like, no, they're just like, oh, yeah, this character happens to be gay in this thing.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. We need queer people in the writer's room, or else we're going to have straight cis people representing us, and our stories will be fucked up. They'll be bad.
Well, and like, so this actually made me think just recently about like, there was a video that I saw years ago from Feminist Frequency about the Bechdel test and how I was actually introduced to it. And that year, I think there were 9 Best Picture nominees. It was the year that Moneyball was one of the nominees. And she looked at them and she was like, of like the 8 or 9 Best Picture nominees, I think only 2 of them passed the Bechdel test. Moneyball literally had 2 women in it, and they never even talked to each other. Like, that entire movie had 2 women. And I watched it and didn't even think about it. Like, and that was the thing where, like, I didn't even notice that there was a lack of representation. And the interesting thing is, I feel like right now, unfortunately, when we see a lot of LGBTQ characters, a lot of people who normally wouldn't notice a lack of women, they notice the presence of them, and then they start talking about it. And so what's kind of interesting is that, like, women somehow became invisible, while, like, the gays became a visible problem, or like the queer, you know, representation became a queer or a visible problem. And so I think there's this weird thing of like, because I feel like we're trying to make everything right, but until like people get used to stuff, you know, being there, you know, we can't even go invisible yet. Like, it's kind of interesting because like right now there's such a spotlight, but it's not always the best one. And like, and so I feel like it's another problem. I don't know if I even made anything clearer, but I thought it was kind of interesting to sort of see like, at least it was a blind spot of mine for a long time, at least, about women in movies. Like, I didn't even think about it until someone pointed out, and I was like, oh shit. Excuse me. Yeah, now my husband and I, like, whenever we see any movie, we walk out and we're like, did it pass?
Yeah.
And can you explain Bechdel for those who don't know?
So it's basically that are there 2 women in a movie? Some people want those women to both have names. Crazy people. So rule 1 is, are there 2 women in this movie? Second rule is, do they talk to each other? Third rule is, do they talk about something other than a man? And it's just amazing how often, like, the male perspective is the thing that pushes the narrative forward so much that 2 women can only talk about the thing that keeps this movie going, which is him, you know. And it's just kind of this thing. And you know, also, I know, like, the husband, he actually recently started talking about, he wanted to call it the Big Del test, another sort of thing of like, is there a character of size in anything that isn't used as a joke, you know, or talking about like, I'm doing my best and I'm dieting, you know, like, is there anything where you can just have a big character who's just a character? You know.
Yeah.
And it's also not, just a quick wrap up, it's also not always just because something passed the Bechdel test doesn't mean it's great either.
Oh, not at all. Not at all.
The bare minimum.
Yeah, that's the minimum.
Bare minimum.
And that's spun off other tests like Makomori, and there's
Yeah.
a bunch of other like, media tests people use to see whether something is truly inclusive. But that's, again, I've said the bare minimum.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Before because we probably have to run, everyone should promote themselves. Where can you find everyone here?
Cool.
So I think,
for it.
yeah.
Bit Different Podcast, Bit Diff Podcast on Twitter, Instagram. I am also at Fast Danger on Twitter.
And I'm at Satine the Dream on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook.
You can find me on this one's website, pride.com. I also run my own YouTube channel, Jessie Gender, where I talk about like social and political issues through fandoms, mostly Star Trek, but not always exclusively. So yeah, follow me there.
All my work is on pride.com. I'm on Twitter at Raffy, BYRAFFY, and yeah.
I'm Clarkeisha Kent on Instagram, and then on Twitter I am I write all day _ So, and you can find my articles on entertainmentweekly.com.
Nice.
All right.
Thank you all.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.